Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dominic Sanders, one of the Equity Fellow organizers for the event. I hope that you all have been enjoying Summit thus far. I have the pleasure of introducing our closing speaker, Dr. Kamau Bobb. If you have never heard Dr. Bobb speak, then you're really in for a treat. Immediately after the keynote, we will engage in an open discussion about computing education when democracy is under siege. Dr. Bobb is a global leader for is Dr. Bobb is the global lead for diversity strategy and research at Google and is the founding senior director of Constellation Center for Equity in Computing at Georgia Tech. He is an engineer and science and technology policy scholar whose work focuses on relationships between equity in STEM enterprises, large educational systems, and the structural conditions that influence contemporary American life. Without further ado, Dr. Kamau Bobb.
Greetings, everyone. In this new virtual world, it's difficult to have a heartfelt connection. I'm sitting at the screen looking at myself. But I hope you're all well. I hope that the day has gone well thus far, and also that you've been patient with the various ups and downs and perturbations of this virtual platform, and your eyes are all right. What I would like to do is to begin with where I'm going to end. We were all together, as you know, in Phoenix in the before times at the last CSTA meeting. I think it was about 197 degrees or something like that. But there, the premise of what I'll say here is the same as I said then. So we're essentially a community of practitioners, of supporters of each other. So in beginning where I'll end, what I would offer is my encouragement and my thanks, and also just to offer a moment again of cheerleading, of rooting for you, supporting the work that you're doing. And I hope that you interpret this not as the platitude of, teachers are the greatest and just go do what you do, but rather I do understand and appreciate in some ways the difficulty that has transpired between then and now, having to look at these screens and deliver incredibly complicated content in an asynchronous way, where you're looking at blank screens and students don't turn on the cameras, trying to figure out even what it means to develop pedagogical style in this strange, inhuman transaction. The difficulty of that is extraordinary. I'm watching my own daughter upstairs going through it. And even as a parent of a child going through that, even watching it is painful. So in the end, what I'm going to say is that what you're doing is incredibly important, especially now when we know that the society is being pulled apart. So the ability to have a future rests centrally, as it always has been, on a sound education. That said, I wanted to begin just quickly going through a couple thoughts. I want to bookend with what I thought was a very salient point from Dr. Scott this morning. One of the things that she raised is that CS education is not apolitical. And when we were together in Phoenix the last time, one of the criticisms that I got was that I was too political. So let me forewarn you that I'm going to be political again. I think it's important for us to consider where we are in the moment. And I, in every instance, feel that CS education, irrespective, the things that we're doing in translating education right now, especially in the context of equity, justice, and fairness, has to be put in the context of what the political environment that we are is. That January 6th event, to me, it's a historic marker that constrains, in many ways, the significance of what we're doing. And if you would bear with me just for a second, I want to put it in a historical context because I think it's important. It's important, particularly here, because it was something that transpired between now and when we were together the last time. If you would bear with me, my interpretation of the moment that we're in is that we are going through essentially the transition between a second Reconstruction and a second Jim Crow. So in many ways, when we're thinking about this in historical terms, we often think about it as ancient history. So the first Reconstruction era from 1865 to 1877 after the Civil War was when the United States was trying to reconcile itself. It was trying to heal itself after having been torn asunder with the Civil War in support and over the issue of slavery. We go through this period up until 1877 when the federal troops were pulled out and the ideology of the Southern states rose again and entered in Jim Crow. So from then, we went through another essentially American apartheid all the way up, I would argue, until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So we haven't really been a modern country until 1964, 65 with the Voting Rights Act, and I would argue until 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. So all up until that time, we haven't had a structure designed with the intent of equity, justice, and fairness for everyone in the United States. We just haven't. So only for 57 years have we actually been a modern country that even extols the virtues that the founding fathers of this nation prescribed for us. So what we've done, if we think about where we go from here, that particular period of time, now we're in this second mode where the culminating moment of the second Reconstruction, I think, was with the ascendancy of President Obama. And what we see now, the moment that we're in, January 6th, the Confederate flag waving in the United States Capitol. The significance of that, compounded by the coronavirus, puts our educational infrastructure right at the center of where the American democratic process is going to go. And I think that context is very important for this, not only for CS education, but for education, period. So what is our task? Our task now is to recognize all of the things that we've been discussing all day. There are certainly pedagogical things that we have to address, but there is this larger issue. When companies and cities now are making economic dependent arguments on tech futures, where they're hinging their whole economic development strategy, the future of these cities, Atlanta is certainly one of them, on having a tech workforce, that requires having a population who has the ability to engage with these skills. And obviously that centers on the work that you all and that we do together. So therefore, in this modern environment, where the economic recovery coming out of the destruction of COVID, coincident with our challenges to the democratic nature of this country itself, pitted against the issues of race which haven't disappeared, our ability to form an educated, technically savvy, equally distributed citizenry is central to the functioning democratic process in the United States. For us to be whole, for us to have a central set of common shared values, understanding what humanity means, and to make sure that as we're building these technical economies as we go forward, that everybody has access to them. And I take it from what Dr. Scott said this morning, that means that the work that we're doing is not apolitical. It's highly, functionally, critically important to the way that this society is going to work. The other thing that I have to repeat here that we've been talking about for the last several months, all in our various constituencies, is that all of these things that are in between the COVID and this racial polarity that we're feeling, who's getting crushed in the center of that? These are tectonic plates that are banging against each other, and who's getting crushed in the middle? Those are poor people. Those are people of color, Black people, brown people, kids that we know that Dr. Scott pointed out this morning, that are having to sit in the parking lot in Taco Bell to be able to get access to the internet such that they can do their schoolwork. Meanwhile, the rest of us who work at Google and Georgia Tech, we're at home, we're comfortable, air conditioning, heat, broadband access. We haven't really missed a beat. We haven't experienced the grind of this striation of the United States. So we know, without saying, but I'm reiterating this point that we are all engaged in, because I think it's important for us not to lose sight of how significant this all is. That this is a totally bifurcated society, completely and totally bifurcated. We all know it. And our role in all of this becomes central to the way that we can coalesce, the way that we can heal, and ultimately the way that we can provide pathways to the future for people to be viable citizens, people of color. All folks from all regions, from all parts of the country, have an opportunity to have a civic value in a robust democratic republic. That's our responsibility. Those aren't things that you don't already know, but given what you're doing, given what all of us are trying to do, I think it is worth repeating such that it's clear the significance, despite the difficulty of what we're doing. So I want to close as I began by suggesting that the work that you all are doing, that we're doing together, is essentially more important now historically than it has ever been in our lives. I've grown up, I'm in my late 40s, entirely in the second Reconstruction in the way that I've defined it. I was not born in the era where I was born without rights. That means that we have to protect it, to make sure that the country doesn't go down the road of a second Jim Crow, which is possible. We have to choose the other direction. And in order to do that, the education that we provide is sacrosanct. It's meaningful, it's important, it's critical to the future that we would like to build together. So let's have a discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, Dr. Bobb, thank you for getting our minds and gears energized and engaged if they weren't already. So again, attendees, making sure you all are posting your questions so we can answer them. So Dr. Bobb, our first question comes from Chip, and he says, I really appreciate the concept of a second Reconstruction in Jim Crow. What are the policies that we need to make this movement in history reconstructive rather than oppressive and the new Jim Crow? Where do we start?
Well, there are a number of things that are already happening, and I don't want to stray too far away from the computing issues themselves. But at a minimum, we do, as a national point of view, we have to establish policies that are rooted in people's humanity. The idea that we're stripping people's children away, that we're offering hysterectomies to women. I mean, we're operating in modes that are nearly medieval. So some of those things have to be redressed. But relative to education, I think that we need to make sure that we are not losing sight that the structure of education in the before times was broken. And as we go through this process of trying to reconstruct it, we have to have an open mind to what that policy structure is going to be. The funding structure didn't work before. We had teachers on strike in multiple states. You forget that before municipalities were gutted by resources and economics before the COVID hit. So now we're going to have to reconstruct that. And we also have to be very clear and plain about the challenges to the discipline. Computer science education is a very delicate educational policy. And so as we're going through this remediation and trying to get people back on track, the priorities are going to be math, English language arts, and social studies, because those are the standard metrics against which everyone is held accountable. So we have to make sure that we have a place, and this just doesn't become lost in the triage as we're going forward.
Gotcha. So our next question, both you and Dr. Scott referenced the systematic issues at play. Given that most of us are teachers, how do we work towards disrupting inequalities that are built upon deeply inequitable systems? What is within our control?
That's an important question. So there is the, trying to identify what the boundaries of autonomy are. And I would give a very specific example. So one of the things that Dr. Scott pointed out earlier is that the patterns around APCSA, for example, have essentially been the same all along. The growing rate in APCS principles is laudable, but even the passing rates there have been, is essentially maintained the same bifurcated patterns. So one of the things that I think individual teachers and teaching and departments can do is that the way that the advisement structure works, I think this is a clear part of this problem, is that in many cases, students are not advised to take the advanced courses, particularly students of color, because there isn't an assumption that their intellect is robust enough to handle those things. They're not given the positive feedback loop to suggest that you would be able to take on these more difficult courses. And then what ends up happening is that students align themselves with the lowest expectations that are provided to them by the counselors, by the teachers themselves, and ultimately by the school community. So one thing that teachers themselves can do is to break that pattern and disagree with advisors, or vice versa. If you're an advisor, you may disagree with the placement the teachers are exacting on students when you see the patterns emerging that we've seen in time after time in school after school. Jane Margolis in the deep end. Forgive me, Jane. What's the name of that book? In the shallow end. Anyway, what she has laid out, stuck in the shallow end. Yes, thank you. What she has laid out there is that those patterns are essentially the manifestations of people's attitudes about intellect.
All right, the next question. The Gallup suggests that many students face challenges beyond their control when it comes to gaining a viable education. How do we fix the structural barriers?
Some of those are things that individual teachers, of course, can't do on their own. None of us can do those things by ourselves. But I do think, again, the way that Dr. Scott framed it this morning, we have to be open to considering what these other variables are and making sure that we're taking into account whether or not people have food to eat, whether or not people are safe, whether or not people feel the comfort that's necessary to engage cognitively. If you're stressed and afraid, you can't learn anything. So to that extent, I think, and this is a vague answer, I know, because these problems are enormous, but I do think that offering some creativity and openness to the variation of students' circumstances is an important way to offer a problem set that could be more accommodating to their individual needs.
Gotcha. The next one says, what are some of your books to read as an educator for equity education?
It's funny, in February, Black people are popular in February, but I've been asked this often. And my favorite right now is, I have two, but Caste is on top of that list. The Origins of Our Discontents. It's by Isabel Wilkerson. And there's a particular point that she makes in there where she talks about this caste system as being a kind of a universal cultural challenge. But one of the things that I thought that she laid out well is that the dominant caste in the United States it's analogous to white people. That some of the animus between the dominant caste and the subordinate castes, it's not personal animus. It's not that they're individual white people who have some angst against Black people, for example, but rather that's just the way the culture goes. That's the way she describes it is those are the worn out grooves of culture that we just expect. So I think that is one where it offers a framework that I found to be elucidating.
That makes sense. The next question says, can ed startups focus on racial equity and gap closing play a role in crafting solutions?
They absolutely can. And I think here is where we have to think about what are the institutional actors that are involved in providing this education. So if we take the variables of the educational system in its totality, there are going to be some of those variables that we deem to be immutable. So as the legislative mandates for CS education increase, as states are saying that you have to have CS education for graduation, for example, there is going to be a lag in the ability to deliver on those mandates. There's not going to be enough teachers. There's not going to be enough content. There's not going to be enough pedagogy. It's not, et cetera. So that's where I think that these ed tech companies play a very critical role, at least in one dimension, where there's going to have to be complementary offerings to provide for the shortcoming of the teacher core. I mean, I know I'm talking to CSTA, so you well know that in all of your individual schools, you may be the only person who's doing what you do. And if the state comes along and says that everybody in this school has to have this education, you're going to have complementary services to offer that. Yep. So that's one dimension. And there are several others, but to get to some more questions, I think that that's an important component.
Yeah, and your answer actually directly segues into our next question. The next one says, how do we get our students active in politics and direct action in the world that they feel like is not listening to them?
Well, I think one is that the students, over the summer, one of the things that I was most inspired by is just looking out the door and seeing all these young people trying to burn this whole place down. They were upset, they were angry, and they were out there. So if they felt that the world wasn't listening, they made the rest of us listen to them. So I think part of the challenge with us in schools is to have as a foundational principle of our education is civic orientation. And it's not civics in the old way, but we're just not really addressing some of these salient and pertinent issues in ways that make students understand what's at stake. So here, particularly in the CS world and STEM world more broadly, uh, and things that I've said before, is that we have to make a distinction between training people and educating them. Because we strip down so much of the education, they're just being trained to go get a job at Google or Intel or Microsoft or whatever, as if that's the only reason they're going to school is to go get a job. And you can have a highly trained and profoundly uneducated population if we continue down that road. So to me, an answer to that question is to engage that. We have to engage them in ways that are creative and that are social and are pertinent and are relevant and contemporary.
So how does that get our students better prepared for the industry? How do you think it bridges that gap?
I think it could be profound because the industry is failing. I mean, I don't want to hide behind the fact that Google is all over the news right now. Why? Because the culture that's internal to Google is similar to the culture that's internal to the United States. The United States is turning on itself and killing Black people. Google, in many instances, has the same problem where we have these lofty ideals, but time and time and time again, you see Black people leaving, excoriating the company for the culture that exists inside there. So we're not different. It's an American company with an American ailments. So there, I think having this kind of education that I was alluding to before is a precursor for changing the culture of these institutions, changing the culture of civic engagement, changing the culture and expectations of diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion in ways that those things are instinctive to us. You don't have to go to some unbiased training class, which we all know are limited in their utility.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're consistently all along indoctrinated with what democratic principles and justice foundations mean, then industry will itself change because the people who make up the industry are themselves different.
All right, and our last question, what do you want the teachers to leave today with?
You froze there for a bit. So
Oh, sorry. The last question is, what do you want the teachers today to leave with?
I want teachers today to leave with hope, with justice, with commitment, and with the orientation that the whole country is in flux right now. So everything that we do, the precedent is not prescription. So we can do whatever we want. I think the entire process now is up in the air. So notwithstanding the difficulties of the challenges of the moment, I think that hope, creativity, and commitment are the things that we should all be with, irrespective of the difficulty. And this is true for us all. But I think that those three things are sacrosanct, paramount, and those are the things that I would hope that we all leave here with today.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Bobb, for closing us out today in our Equity in Action Summit.
Thank you for having me. And I hope everyone stays well, stays invigorated, and duck so that the Rona can't see you.
All right, so let's move right along. So if you all have not ordered your Equity in Action shirt, what are you guys waiting for? So the proceeds of the shirt go to the conference scholarships for teachers of color and those who teach large concentration of marginalized students. The store will close on March 19th at midnight, and the link is there for you. The Equity in Action Summit does not stop here. We have our post-summit event on April 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern. During the event, you will have opportunity to chat with the director of the Coded Bias film. You will also get a chance to share your action plan with others. If you can't wait that long to chat about the summit with your peers, this Monday, March 8th, you will be able to engage in conversations about Summit via the CSTA discussion board, which more information will follow for that. Our upcoming events. So if you really enjoyed the summit today, you definitely do not want to miss the CSTA annual conference from July 14th through the 16th. And then if you are a teacher leader who cares deeply about equity in computer science, please consider applying to be a part of next year's CSTA Equity Fellowship cohort. Applications will open up in July. And then as we bring Summit to a close on behalf of the Equity Fellows, we would like to once again thank you all for spending your Saturday with us. We hope that this Summit gave you more tools and connections to take away on your journey to increase CS education access to all your students and empower students to use CS in a just way. Later today, you all will receive an email about today's event. Included in the survey, there will also be a spot where you can share your action plan. If you submit your action plan, you will be entered for a raffle for some great prizes. Once you complete the survey, you all will also receive a link and a password to view the coded bias, as well as certificate of attendance. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you at Post Summit. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.